Welcome, comrades. You're listening to The Party Line, a podcast from The Ditch, news and comment from Ireland on theditch.com. I'm Harry Browne.
And I'm Paulie Doyle. You can listen to The Party Line wherever you listen to your podcasts, and you can also follow us, The Ditch, on social media, Twitter, Instagram, and so on.
Paulie and I are in the cellars of the Rosa Luxemburg studio here in the Whistleblower building in Dublin city centre. I know a lot of listeners are curious, those of you who live in Dublin, curious about the Whistleblower, new premises here on South Ann Street, just off Grafton Street. And if you are listening before Saturday, the 21st of March, we are having a kind of a soft launch, special select event, including a recording of this here podcast. And also Owen Higgins in conversation with the Ditch on Saturday afternoon, starting at about 3 o'clock. So contact art@whistleblower.ie if you'd like to come along for that.
And there will also be cake by Kevin Thornton.
Cake by
Very
Kevin.
important to mention.
Cake by Kevin Thornton. Okay, that is very important to mention. So from about 3 o'clock on Saturday the 21st, contact art@whistleblower.ie or contact the Whistleblower on its social media. On the line from London today, we've got investigative journalist Paul Holden of Shadow World Investigation. Sorry, Paul. How are you, Paul? Paul is the author of the great new book, The Fraud.
Yeah, Paul has written, it's the definitive account, really, isn't it, of the sleazy campaign that was enacted to destroy Jeremy Corbyn, destroy the left, and place Keir Starmer into Downing Street.
And beyond that, the efforts to smear Paul himself for his investigations have been a major part of the unraveling of the British government over recent weeks. I mean, Paul, when you think about also the effect that your work has had in your home country of South Africa, you must be one of the most impactful investigative journalists alive today, I would think. No, let tyrants quake in the face of Paul Holden. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you very much for having me. I think we have moved way too quickly away from the discussion of the cake at your event.
I do want to just give a shout out. Also, I know that listeners last week were very delighted to hear from Niamh Ní Bhríon, who is the ongoing co-host on this podcast. She is in Cuba this week, having filled 2 suitcases with desperately needed medical supplies. Our thoughts are with her and, of course, with the Cuban people. Let me see if I can come up with a contrived link to our conversation about Morgan McSweeney with Paul here. Just as a son of Cuba in the form of Marco Rubio has come to guide and hopefully destroy the American empire, we're going to talk today about Morgan McSweeney, the Macroom man who first elevated Keir Starmer and is now helping to sink that same British Prime Minister. Yes, so we'll get the contrived link klaxon playing here. But Paul, if you will bear with us for a minute, we are going to talk first about what's in the ditch this week. There's a lot of really cool stories, and it has been St. Patrick's Day here in Ireland, and I guess there in England as well, over the last few days. So there are some interesting stories that tie into the special relationship, both the one that we have with you, the one that you have with the United States, and of course, the ones we have with each other.
Yes.
Well, Paulie, tell us what's in the ditch.
Well, one of the stories involves a £5.5 million contract that the PSNI in the north has with an Israeli company who they have said they cannot name for national security reasons and also, strangely, for commercial reasons, should they want to bid for a future contract.
That's a very special relationship.
So the contract it began in November of 2019 and it's due to finish in November of this year. There's a lot of things that are interesting about this, one of which is when I sent to the FOI, I said, can you give me an outline of what contracts that are ongoing the PSNI has with Israeli companies, the nature of said contracts and how much they're worth. So, and in the response, the PSNI said, well, we couldn't possibly confirm or deny whether it was these contracts involve sensitive operational technology. Unprompted, I didn't ask. So make of that as you will. I want to give a shout out as well to the Irish News who picked up on this story.
And it's kind of Belfast-based Irish News.
Yeah, great newspaper, and kind of brought the needle forward, so to speak. And they're calling on the PSNI to answer questions about who this company is. There was a review that came out last year, you might remember, which found that the PSNI had used Cellbrite technology, that's an Israeli company, to spy on journalists, to try and find out, illegally, by the way, who their sources were.
Spying on journalists, that must sound familiar, Paul.
Sadly so. Although it seems like you guys are slightly more sophisticated in your techniques than what was used against us.
What else we got, Paulie? Another ditch story. Maybe tell us about Shannon Airport.
Okay. So, as Micheál Martin was, the same day that he was heading for Washington to don the green jersey and also put on the green lipstick, a U.S. military cargo plane on its way back from delivering munitions to Israel as it's conducting its brutal and illegal war on Iran, stopped off in Shannon Airport with diplomatic clearance from the Irish state.
There you go. And then Micheál, of course, has been denying that Shannon has been used to facilitate the American-Israeli war effort. So here we are.
Well, there you go. I mean, what was it he said? That there's no strong evidence that this is happening. But of course, I mean, he doesn't really look. He's not really checking for evidence, is he?
As soon as someone sought the evidence, there it was, just right there on St. Patrick's Day.
Yeah. So, I mean, Shannon is a strategic asset to the American military, to the American empire. And, the Irish government they've done a calculation and they say it's worth, so we can get investment from a small amount of tech companies. It's worth being complicit in whatever crimes the American military is committing and just turning their heads the other way. That's how it works and has worked for some time now.
And of course, some of the overflights and facilitation has ended up hooking up with British air bases where, although Britain has kind of been trying to keep at arm's length from this war, they have been planes have been loading up in Britain as well with munitions for the effort, as it were.
Yeah, I think it's worth mentioning as well that, I mean, it's not just military, it's civilian aircraft are being used to transport munitions to Israel as well.
And
charters, Micheál Martin is kind of so afraid of upsetting Washington that they won't enforce Irish law on these companies that have, I mean, quite clearly broken the law, bringing munitions illegally through the state. And they look the other way on that. But if Jim O'Callaghan wants to deport some Nigerian children to make a political point, then the law is the law. But if there's a large, powerful company bringing weapons through Ireland, well, then, how could we possibly be expected to, enforce the law on them?
And speaking of deportations, we know that Shannon was also used for deportation flights from the United States, ICE flights as well. Great, Paulie, thanks. Every week after we kind of review the ditch, we go on to look at some non-ditch media, what's something old or new, borrowed or blue from the non-ditch media, the NDM, that caught our eye, might have provoked or annoyed or interested us in one way or the other. And in honor of Paul Holden's presence today, we decided to dip into a British-Irish co-production in the Sunday Times from the heady days of 2024, just before your election in the UK. When the Sunday Times profiled Keir Starmer's Irish sidekick, or Svengali, or Machiavelli, or whatever we want to call him, Morgan McSweeney. So this article, this profile, interesting in its own right, and it also helps introduce one of the main characters of your fantastic book, Fraud, and that is that Irishman, Morgan McSweeney. So this article from June 2024, and it's co-written by a British journalist, Gabriel Pogrund. I think that's how it's pronounced. The horrendously young Gabriel Pogrund, when I looked him up, it's absolutely heartbreaking. He's a political correspondent at the Sunday Times, still in his 20s. I think he's just turned 30 recently. I have children older than Gabriel Pogrund. Gabriel Pogrund wrote it with one of our own from here in Ireland, Hugh O'Connell, who at the time was with the Sunday Times here in Ireland and has worked in many different publications. Yeah. Where is he now, Paul?
He is a special advisor. He's a government press officer, and he's working directly with Simon Harris.
That's right. So the Taoiseach, the Deputy Prime Minister here in Ireland, Simon Harris, has hired Hugh O'Connell in the meantime, since this rather very, well, we'll look at it in a minute, but a nice profile of Morgan McSweeney, you'd have to say, just as he's about to take power in Britain. In 2024, Hugh O'Connell has gone on to greater things. He's joined the Fine Gael circle in the Deputy Prime Minister's office, and he's alongside Morgan McSweeney's cousin, Claire Mungovan, who's also a special advisor on the team in Simon Harris's office.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's an ecosystem of politicians, of lobbyists, of people in think tanks, of advisors who, I mean, Hugh would have been part of that mold. Paid his dues in the newspapers, would have written stories about what was happening in Leinster House. Anything critical he would have published would have been within, implicitly understood parameters. And not to single him out, but
No,
he
he's
is
a perfectly good reporter, Hugh. There's no and well regarded here. But it is symptomatic, we can say, of kind of the systematic relationship.
The revolving door, as they call it, political correspondents becoming special advisors or that kind of thing, joining think tanks and kind of thing.
Paul, Gabriel Pogrund is someone that has a special relationship with you because you were a source for an important story that he and one of his colleagues did in 2023, which was the revelation about Labour Together's illegal funding. Do you want to tell us about that?
Sure. I mean, what happened there was that I've been investigating Labour Together for about 2 years up until that point. And as of mid 2023, I think July or August, that I first approached Gabriel Pogrund. And actually, the person I approached simultaneously with that was Matt Taibbi in the States, who was doing some interesting work on what used to be called, or was called at the time, the Twitter files, which was this disclosure of documents from within Twitter about the ways in which the allegation was that the Biden administration had been overreaching in the censorship of ordinary citizens. And the story was pretty damning, but quite straightforward at the same time, which is that between 2017 and 2020, Morgan McSweeney ran this think tank called Labour Together, through which we now know, pursued these secret projects to destroy the prospects of a Corbyn-led Labour Party. And then to choose effectively Keir Starmer as Corbyn's replacement, as the means by which they could recapture the Labour Party for what is increasingly being revealed to be a sort of a Mandelsonian politics, or sort of a politics that's pliant or acceptable to the Mandelson-Epstein class. And during this period of time between 2018 and 2020, they're taking in hundreds of thousands of pounds of donations, which they're not reporting in violation of electoral law. And the documents that I had, I came and I gave to Gabriel, spoke to two. They raised questions about two things. One was whether the failure to report donations was potentially purposeful, whether this was part of a broader strategy on the part of Labour Together to avoid detection while they underwent their various types of covert planning and covert projects. This was something that was strategically useful for them to not bring attention to themselves, because it would have become very obvious to people. The people would have asked sort of reasonable questions. What is this tiny, very boring seeming think tank doing with over £500,000 in donations? How do you explain how you're spending it? And the second thing is that at the end of 2020, after Morgan McSweeney has left, there's a new staff member at Labour Together who uncovers the fact that they haven't reported donations, and then raises that with the Electoral Commission, who does an investigation. The outcome of which is the Electoral Commission finds Labour Together guilty of failing to report donations, but effectively gives them a slap on the wrist, a very small fine. I think it's about £14,000, really cost of doing business sort of stuff. And the documents that I gave to Gabriel really raised questions about whether Labour Together were being candid with the Electoral Commission while they were under investigation. And there's one particular email involving Labour Together's lawyer writing to Morgan McSweeney, sort of raising questions with what actually happened at the time, and then on its face seeming to suggest that there was a possibility that they might want to not disclose certain things to the Electoral Commission because it might be difficult for them to explain. And Gabriel Pogrund published that story in November 2022. It was supposed to come out earlier, but it was, obviously October 7th happened, and that delayed things quite substantively. And at the same time, I started publishing stories with Matt Taibbi in the States, looking specifically at what was Morgan McSweeney doing with this undeclared money at the time, which, I tell that story in more depth in the book, but effectively, one of the things that Morgan McSweeney is doing, and he's doing multiple things, is sort of directly intervening and inflaming the anti-Semitism crisis that is undermining the credibility and sort of the voting coalition of a Corbyn-led government, and also launching these pretty despicable attacks on independent left-leaning media that Morgan McSweeney and his allies see as an obstacle to their political ambitions. And now we know that the response of Labour Together to that reporting was to be extremely alarmed and to do some very disturbing things.
Right. Okay. So we're talking about this period in 2023 into 2024 when this story is published, and Keir Starmer is on his way into government. He's the overwhelming favorite to win the election in 2024, as he did. But this reporting relates to the period when Jeremy Corbyn, for the most part, the period when Jeremy Corbyn was the party leader, and Labour Together was essentially an operation to, we know now in retrospect, an operation to discredit his leadership, and partly, as you say, with the anti-Semitism crisis. I want to look a little closer at the article here for a couple of minutes. This article that Gabriel Progrin writes a few months after, with your help, doing the expose about the illegal funding of Labour Together. He writes this with Hugh O'Connell, this rather complimentary profile of McSweeney for the Sunday Times. And it's kind of very interesting from an Irish standpoint because the way it connects McSweeney's sort of foxy cleverness with his Irishness and with the and with the history of the Irish freedom struggle. Paulie, you might read some of the Irish section of this profile.
Gladly. To understand his mission, starting Macroom, whose present echoes dark episodes of the past, famine-era mass graveyards and a castle ruined by Cromwellian troops.
So the famine and Cromwell. Yeah.
Then the IRA. That looms over the town centre. McSweeney was born in 1977 and had a comfortable upbringing, the son of Tim, an accountant, and Carmel, a retired office worker and an avid bridge player.
Avid bridge player.
That's good to know.
A nice touch, isn't it?
Yeah. His paternal grandfather, Michael, served the IRA during Ireland's War of Independence from Britain, winning a medal for his service. He was stopped once by the Black and Tans and threatened, but they didn't find anything on him. Tim McSweeney
they didn't find anything on him, says Dad. So I'll read some more. The McSweeneys were bitterly split by the Irish Civil War, but Michael supported the victorious pro-treaty side. That's Michael, the grandfather or the great-grandfather, who joined the party that would become the centre-right Fine Gael. McSweeney's parents were steadfast supporters of that party, which, by the time of his birth, was implacably opposed to the violent republicanism of Sinn Féin, whose advocates included Corbyn and Abbott.
There
Aha! So we've tied it all back. So a family of Irish freedom fighters who, however, came to reject violent republicanism, and therefore any of the British fellow travelers with said violent republicanism by the late 20th, early 21st century. Jeremy Corbyn and Diane Abbott, that refers to.
He supported the good IRA, not the bad IRA.
Yes, they were only the good IRA.
Yes.
Exactly. The profile goes on, probably in its more kind of British-oriented part, to further portray McSweeney as motivated by kind of high principles. Here's another quote. A foundational belief since his Lambeth days, he worked in the London borough of Lambeth for a time, is that Labour is doomed when it prizes ideological purity or internal unity over public service. It's public service, you see, that Morgan McSweeney is all about. McSweeney went to work as a director of a group called Labour Together, which we've been hearing about from Paul. His objective was not to destroy Corbyn, but rather, when the leader eventually stood down, regain control of the party. Not to destroy Corbyn. That's right, Paul, isn't it? Nothing to do with destroying.
Well, it's actually quite interesting because that's not the version that's then told later. Because Pogren and Patrick Maguire publish a book, and would have been, I'm trying to think when it would have been early 2025, called Get In, which is a follow-up to a book they wrote called Left Out, which is they did sort of like an internal, in-depth profile of the last 2 years of Corbynism and the leadership of Corbynism. And they're much more explicit in the 2025 book and basically saying that actually Morgan McSweeney was involved in this multiple year-long act of subterfuge, where specifically going after Jeremy Corbyn and Corbynism was the intent. I mean, I think it's interesting about that is that's obviously right before the election, so it's quite it's quite soft soaping of Morgan McSweeney. It also doesn't stand at all with what actually the people involved in Labour Together have themselves said at the time, by the time of this article. It's actually quite interesting because from 2022 onwards, Steve Reed in particular, who I think is a combination of being both quite a chilling and quite a mediocre person at the same time, is like practically vibrating with desire to tell people about how brilliant their secret projects actually were. And he gives us this I'm thinking particularly he does this interview with the Telegraph in 2022, which I quote in the book, where very explicitly it's talking about secret projects to destroy Corbynism. That they saw the hard left, as they call it, or the far left, as a mortal moral threat to the Labour Party, and they set about destroying it. So even by the time Pogman writes this article in 2024, that's sort of pretty obviously publicly known. And then in 2025, when the book comes out, it's much more, it's very, very, very explicit. They call it, as far as I remember, I'm going to slightly misquote it, but they call it like one of the, a grand act of subterfuge, effectively. And this multiple 2-year, 3-year campaign to undermine the prospects of a Jeremy Corbyn-led government. And of course, Labour Together themselves are saying this stuff in 2023. In April 2023, they sort of relaunch as an organisation, and it's quite interesting thing to talk about how they've now shaped this current parliament in so doing. But one of the things they do is they put out all these statements about how important Labour Together was to first the leadership of Keir Starmer, but also in how these MPs, these 8 brave MPs, had come together to effectively tackle and eradicate the hard left. And by that stage, there's been multiple interviews with people who are very close to McSweeney saying things like, Morgan McSweeney has no time for the hard left. He wants to literally eliminate or annihilate them from the Labour Party. So this idea that actually they weren't involved in a factional fight is madness.
It is funny, and the fact that Morgan McSweeney perhaps had been a useful source for journalists over the years and was kind of riding high and was about to enter power and might continue to be a useful source from within Downing Street might have something to do with the soft soap that happens around this coming up to an election like this. It's certainly not uncommon in Irish politics and journalism, it would have to be said.
Can we talk a little bit about McSweeney's? Sorry, you're breaking up again.
The story, Paul, that the story of illegality in that Labour Together mission that you did help them break the year before just comes in at the end of a sentence there. So it says that McSweeney received funding from former donors to Blair and Miliband to research party members, much of it undeclared. And that's about it for that. The other thing, but of course, Morgan McSweeney, just to bring listeners up to date who may not be aware of this, Morgan McSweeney has gone from Starmer's inner circle, and who knows what may become of him. This article from 2024 reckoned that when the time came for McSweeney to part with Starmer, he could make a fortune giving lessons to progressive parties around the world. How's that looking, Paul, do you reckon, for Morgan McSweeney?
Well, I'm not sure how much Morgan McSweeney is going to be in demand on the speaking circuit at this point in time. Not least because he's effectively being the person who is being sort of thrust front and center as the reason why the UK appointed Peter Mandelson to be the ambassador to Washington under Starmer. We now have had these recent disclosures, which I'll speak about in a bit. But what's very clear from it is that Mandelson and McSweeney have this very long-standing relationship. It's been quite enlightening even to me after having done this book, the extent to which Mandelson's actually involved in the nitty-gritty of McSweeney's project from quite a long period back, and certainly from 2022 onwards in terms of reshaping the Labour Party. And I think that has somewhat tainted his personal brand. It also hasn't helped, that he has led the Labour Party and he was chief of staff to the Prime Minister pretty much within 3 months of becoming after Keir Starmer was elected, the chief of staff who was originally appointed, Sue Gray, was pretty much knifed in the back pretty much immediately on this sort of horrific factional briefing that was done against her by unknown individuals who seem to have good connections to the media and to brief ugly stories about her. The outcome of which is that basically Morgan McSweeney, runs the government and really sort of guides the strategic direction over the next 18 months and runs the Labour Party into the ground in terms of public popularity. I mean, it is now polling at sort of basically unimaginable levels of unpopularity across the country. Starmer is now the least popular prime minister since record began, excepting Liz Truss, who's only in there for about 45 days or something. They've now lost this. There's been these 2 very important by-elections. They lost one in a constituency in Wales called Caerphilly, and And I think that was a Senate by-election, and that's a constituency the Labour Party has held easily for 100 years,
Right.
where they literally didn't even bother counting. The joke was, we don't count Labour Party votes in Caerphilly, we weigh them, you know. And they've just lost an incredibly important by-election in Gorton and Denton in Manchester, which is Andy Burnham's stomping ground, and they came third. They came third behind the Greens, who won, and Reform. There was a poll that came out yesterday by YouGov, and there's lots of, I don't want to get into the weeds of annoying British polling politics, which has somehow become quite relevant, but because Nigel Farage has been raising a big stink about how polling figures are published. But the YouGov published their unedited headline voting intention figures, and so not remodeled by constituency, not modeled by an MRP analysis or anything like that. And it shows like the current headline voting intention in the country is only 11% of the population will vote for the Labour Party,
Jesus.
which is astonishing.
Yeah.
I mean, utterly, utterly astonishing. They got 33% of the votes, which is not very much. They won this overwhelming victory on a very small national vote. But I mean, 11% would be, at that point, the Labour Party would almost cease to exist
Yeah.
as a parliamentary force.
Yeah, and that's a larger story about both the Tories and the Labour Party, in effect, having self-destructed in recent years.
Sure, and self-destructing precisely because they're not progressive in any sort of meaningful way. That, what's happened very quickly is the Labour Party has indicated and actually sent pretty loud messages that we are effectively a continuity of the Tories in many ways, that we are going to launch attacks on disability. We're going to basically be entirely compliant with the existing sort of national security paradigm. We are going to refuse to increase taxes on the rich, but we're going to squeeze taxes on the middle class and small businesses. We're going to totally renege on environmental commitments. We're going to adopt a policy of like massive deregulation. That, at this point, the Labour Party, and trying to outflank reform on the right on things like asylum and immigration. And that is absolutely central to the fact that they are so deeply unpopular, is that lots of people voted for the Labour Party thinking it would look something like a Labour Party that they would know about, even if it's a Blairite version. And people have been so horrified by just how right-wing it is, and how aggressively this political faction has not just ignored a left, but actively sought to alienate, isolate, attack a left, and do things like prescribe Palestine Action as a terrorist organization, which is like deeply unpopular across the country.
Exactly.
Or right now, this is a political strategy to, they've gone and attacked a left that actually maybe voted for them, and now they're being left with basically nobody willing to support them whatsoever. It's a pretty strange and weird position to be in, headed by this prime minister that everybody thinks is basically an idiot. Who doesn't know what he's doing.
McSweeney's idiot. I think that the other thing, of course, is the support for the genocide. You mentioned Palestine Action there, but the British government's part of the continuity from Tory to Starmer was the ongoing standing by Israel. And I think we still have something to learn about McSweeney and his history there. McSweeney himself was on a kibbutz as a young man in the 1990s, for example. And certainly the pro-Israel slant of this particular Labour government, I think, has been part of what's made it so unpopular.
Yeah. Paul, I wanted to ask you, I know you've mentioned before that it would have been very, very difficult for Jeremy Corbyn to do anything about McSweeney and this plot because it was being done in secret. But I'm wondering, do you have any thoughts on, could Corbyn and his allies have done more, kind of broadly speaking, about the right-wing elements of his party who were actively seeking to undermine him? I think back to, say, you remember the interview that Jess Phillips gave? I think it was to the Times, where she said, I can't see Labour winning. Why wasn't she kicked out of the party? Is there anything else is there more that Corbyn could have done? I mean, I think if somebody in the Conservatives under Boris Johnson had given an interview like that, they would have been turfed out of the party, for example.
I mean, if you speak to Corbynite advisors from the time, you'll get basically half of them saying we should have kicked everyone out and we should have been just as brutal as them, right? Like, a lot of people look at McSweeney and say we should be like McSweeney, that we should have been like him, we should have been taking control of the bureaucracy and running it in a way that we make sure only our allies take it over, we kick out the whole right wing. And I always thought, well, first of all, it's sort of an odd question to ask because it never would have happened, because it's just not the style of politics that Jeremy Corbyn and his particular faction of the Labour Party represented, which is highly idealistic, right? Like they might be naive, but that is actually their political faction that they exist in, is they do believe in like principles of democracy and participation. They are willing to accept, for example, when they lose a democratic vote, that's the will of the people. They're willing to accept that they lose internal battles. So yeah, maybe they should have been more aggressive in tackling their factional allies, but they never would have been because it's not something that was like baked into their political
Yeah.
philosophy in a sort of meaningful way. I mean, I think if you're going to try and isolate like where this project failed, and there's multiple things you can criticize it for, but ultimately the thing that causes electoral defeat is Brexit. That's the really key issue that means that the Labour Party loses in 2019. And there, I think that was actually a leadership failure. Like, I think genuinely speaking, that at the top level, the Corbynite leadership should have been much more aggressive and explicit in explaining to people that if you have a second referendum campaign, we will lose the next election. And you need to choose at this point between whether you're going to rerun a Brexit election or have a socialist government. You can't have two of those things together. That's just not a viable option at that point in time. Of course, we now know, and I think there's a large degree of skepticism about whether the sort of the hardcore Remain campaigners in the Labour Party and affiliated groups who were, for example, quite closely associated with Peter Mandelson, were sort of pushing that as a hot button issue precisely because it was something that they knew would effectively divide the Labour Party's base and sort of and guide it towards destruction. So I'm a bit of a fudgy answer. I'm sorry, but I generally think that the lessons to be learned from McSweeneyism, even though it succeeded in its short-term project, is actually it's laid the ground for Labour's long-term irrelevance because you can't have a mass political party that's run on hyper bureaucratic, like in an incredibly bureaucratic and factional way. It's just not possible to hold together like a modern voting coalition right now. If you're going to run a party like that, what you'll get is you'll maybe get 4 or 5 years where you take control of this thing, but then as soon as it meets the public, it falls apart because it has no intellectual rigor, it has no depth, it has no public base, it has no charismatic support. All the MPs that you've parachuted in, everybody hates because you've chosen them for all the wrong reasons. So it may have been that, Corbynism may have lasted another few years, but I think even that would have been problematic for the Labour Party long term. Because in the end, the Labour Party does best when it is like a fairly held democratic contestation between its various different factions.
So, Paul, let's bring the story forward and bring you personally back into it because I know that maybe some of this is stuff that you're not entirely ready to talk about, but the smearing of you has been a big part of, look at why McSweeney is gone, why Josh Simons is gone from the Cabinet Office. And can you tell us some of the background to that and how it is that you have become not only someone who has investigated and told this story so brilliantly as you do in your book, but someone whose targeting has become part of the story?
Sure. I mean, what we now know, I mean, I had some sense of it, but not a huge amount of detail. And I do write a little bit about it in the prologue to my book, because luckily we were approached by a whistleblower who came to us sort of mid 2024 or 2025, I think it was, to tell us about what was going on. But effectively, after I'd approached Gabriel Pogren and he published that story in November, at the bottom of his article about the money, and that article is pretty, it doesn't quite go as far as I would have liked on the basis of the documentation we have, but it clearly sends a message like there's an issue here, that this is something to be explored. This is very damaging potentially to McSweeney and to Starmer and this whole project. And at the bottom of that article, it says, documents from the Electoral Commission have been provided by Paul Holden. And on the same day, my publisher put up a little brief blurb about what's going to be in the fraud. And then I started publishing those articles with Matt Taibbi. What we now know is that pretty much immediately after those articles come out, Labour Together hires a firm called APCO Worldwide, which is a sort of a reputation management firm. The person who does the hiring is Josh Simons, who was the director of Labour Together at the time, a sort of a protege of McSweeney, who then has subsequently parachuted into a safe seat during the 2024 general election and then became a sort of a junior minister, overseeing digital ID, which is very ironic, seeing as there's all sorts of concerns about civil liberties around digital ID. And what APCO is effectively contracted to do, we've actually now seen the contract, which I hadn't seen before, that's been published. And the contract literally said that APCO worldwide will produce a package of materials that will proactively undermine the coordinated attacks being launched by Paul Holden and Matt Taibbi. And they engage in like a long form investigation into me and my colleagues. Some of it's, just going through what I have seen is them going through public materials on me, what's sort of relatively open source stuff, and then trying to sort of frame that to make it seem like I'm sort of a mad conspiracy theorist. Uh, but the more substantive and the more disturbing investigation is then done in January 2024. And Labour Together seem to subcontract or bring in some people to help them do a human intelligence report, as they call it, which is, if anybody knows anything about the world of intelligence, a human intelligence report is another phrase for absolutely useless, fraudulent gossip, none of which is true.
Yes, yeah.
I mean, like honestly, if you, I've been doing so much work on national security for the last 15 years, investigating the arms trade. The one thing that I'll never take seriously is a human intelligence report. Seriously, that stuff is half the time it's just totally fabricated, and there's so many absurd information peddlers out there in the world who make so much money off this stuff. But they put together this report called Operation Cannon. Now, the thing that's funny about Operation Cannon is, first of all, what I now know, and what I've been told by a couple of sources recently, is that this Operation Cannon report creates this mad, insane, ridiculous conspiracy theory that I'm somehow an asset or connected to South African intelligence, through which I'm getting information from Russian intelligence. Now, that ignores the fact that for 2.5 years, me and my colleague Andrew couldn't go back to South Africa under threat of arrest because we've both investigated two sitting presidents of the country, and I was subject to targeted burglaries and all sorts of stuff. And Andrew was forced out of Parliament, forced out of the country for trying to investigate corruption on the part of, amongst others, ANC intelligence figures. And also, we've been investigating Russian oligarchs and have been sued and faced extra legal threats from oligarchs as well. So it's a totally ridiculous, bizarre, absolutely insane conspiracy theory.
This is the great Andrew Feinstein, by the way. Andrew Feinstein
exactly,
is your
yeah.
colleague. Yeah,
Andrew
yeah.
Feinstein, who's like, anti-apartheid activist, served in Parliament, anti-corruption activist, was pretty much forced out of the country because he actually stood up to his own political party and to the government and said, you guys have gotten fabulously corrupt very quickly, and I won't accept that. I'm going to stand up to that, and I'm going to reveal it. And he was effectively chased out of South Africa as a result, and has been living in the UK ever since, like me. I left and came to the UK in 2009 after publishing two books on that same incredibly corrupt arms deal that Andrew looked at. And the irony of this Operation Cannon report, their strategic mistake was that for some reason they decided to also investigate Gabriel Pogrund and Harry York, who wrote those two articles, and Henry Dye, who's a Guardian journalist. And they do, even though I'm quite critical at times of Gabriel Pogrund in my book, and I do think that also me and Gabriel Pogrund have like a decent working relationship, and that we are very honest with each other in, we'll work together, but we come from very different perspectives, and we both explicit about that. But what they do is that they investigate Gabriel Pogrund, and it's really ugly stuff, the stuff they say about him. It's genuinely not acceptable, what they've put in there about him. And of course, this document then leaks. I mean, before it leaks, I should say, the one thing that Labour Together tries to do is they try to report me to security services here. So they make a report to what's called the National Cyber Security Centre. Some of those emails have now been published by The Guardian, who got access to them. And it's this mad stuff. They're basically trying to get GCHQ to launch an investigation into me, into whether I've received hacked material, which is entirely untrue, based on this mad, insane, ridiculous conspiracy theory report they have. And they actually attach a truncated version of this ridiculous report they've written, Operation Cannon, and give it to the National Cybersecurity Centre. And as I write in my book, they even then go to The Guardian and try to get The Guardian to run a story where The Guardian's going to run a story saying that the National Cybersecurity Centre is investigating whether Labour Together has been the victim of a hack of the Electoral Commission, and that investigation will look at me, right?
Yeah.
And I have to basically get extremely litigious and say, if this is entirely untrue, if there's any hint in any of your reporting at any stage that I've received a hack, which is, would be devastating to my reputation, devastating to the actual serious meaningful anti-corruption work that I'm doing with the Department of Justice in the US and the National Asset Forfeiture Unit in South Africa, if that stuff comes out, it's really damaging. I say if you run a story that has even like a hint that I've got a hack or I'm under investigation, I'll see you into the absolute goddamn ground. And luckily the article doesn't run.
Yeah. The way it would. It's interesting, Paul, that essentially they try to kick off an investigation and then try to plant a story that an investigation is taking place. I mean, that's that's the kind of circular bullshit that they're pulling here. Is that they are inventing, as you say, on the basis of the flimsiest made up gossip. A story. But it does have its effect to a certain extent, Paul, doesn't it, in terms of the way that, although you got the Guardian to back away from actually reporting on that investigation, it does mean that some of the allegations are somewhat tainted in the eyes of many of our media colleagues. You know, that there's some rumors about that. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think we still need to get to the bottom of that. So basically what's happening right now is that I've got a subject access request into various different organizations, which is they basically have to give me all the information that they're processing on me. But there was an article in the Times saying that effectively these reports were fed into like a broader, what they call a whispering campaign. So even Peter Mandelson apparently was talking about this stuff and saying how that November 2023 article was sort of vaguely connected to Russia in some way. That's what they've reported. So I have this like real deep worry because, and it's hard to know, right? Because obviously my book has done better than I could have expected in a sense that it's driven a lot of front page stories and a big news cycle. And obviously this Operation Cannon stuff now created a massive scandal last month, and Josh Simons was forced to resign. Although I will say that the whole investigation into him is like the most shameful. I think he should never have been cleared by the ethics advisor, and I'm still incredibly angry because I've asked to give evidence to the inquiry into him, and I wasn't even contacted to ask for the evidence that I had, which I think is just utterly disgusting and astonishing. But the upshot is that the book hasn't been reviewed by any single mainstream newspaper. It's often been very difficult for me to like get stories placed. I've had to really work contacts very hard. And sometimes I don't know, from, the media environment here is very hostile to left-wing ideas in general. So it might just be they see I'm left-wing. I'm not that well known here, so I can understand there's a bit of wariness there. But I do need to know. I need to find out, like, were other journalists told about this? Were other people briefed about it? I mean, if Peter Mandelson is going around whispering to people about me and about this work and about some connections to Russia, that could be like really damaging. You know, if people don't know who you are and having to make in a newsroom a decision about like, do we run a story from this guy? And they've also heard rumors that there's like, oh, don't go with this guy. There's some dodgy intelligence connections, and you should be careful of his family. You don't know what his motives are. That's the sort of stuff that could be really hard to navigate. So what I'm trying to get is some hard answers. And I'm hoping they'll come. I should also say that John McDonnell and other people, even the Tory party in Parliament, are now calling for an open public inquiry into Labour Together. Everything they've done since 2017 onwards, and I support that call. I mean, I think there absolutely has to be now at this point. It's just like outrageous that there's no investigation publicly into what they were doing from 2017 onwards and how they've like really captured this Labour Party with like serious like ethical and governance concerns that result.
Yeah, can we talk a little bit about? I mean, what did we learn last week from document release about how Starmer came to appoint Peter Mandelson as ambassador to Washington?
It's such an interesting story, isn't it? I mean, I feel like the Mandelson story is like the almost like the ultimate expression of the McSweeney project, right? So I think the background to some of that disclosure is that we now know a lot more detail actually about how close Mandelson and McSweeney are. We always sort of knew they were close, but like I'll give you a good example. There was an article that came out, I think it was 2 or 3 weeks ago, about the spreadsheet, this internal spreadsheet in the Labour Party, which was being populated in 2020, 2021. It's a Google Docs spreadsheet where Morgan McSweeney was basically keeping a running list of all people in the Labour Party who might want to stand as an MP or a councillor, or people that sort of have the sort of vague ambitions. And they were sort of keeping tabs on them, and then in making comments about things they may have said that could be used against them. And Peter Mandelson was actually involved in editing the spreadsheet according to these newspaper reports. Of course, the Labour Party denied them, but it does seem like he was like involved in the nitty-gritty. So it sort of makes sense that one of the first things they do when Morgan McSweeney is at the absolute height of his power, he's just, Sue Gray's gone, he's chief of staff, is to appoint this guy that absolutely everybody cannot stand. There's nobody in this country who's like, yeah, bring back Peter Mandelson. That's what we need in our politics, is build this guy. What we do discover from that disclosure is two things. One is like the level of due diligence that's done on Mandelson prior to his appointment is like, it's so minimal. It's ridiculous. It's this 2-page report. But even in that 2-page report, there's enough there. You're like, how on earth does this guy get appointed? Because it explicitly says in this due diligence, raises his connections to Epstein, also raises the fact that, he runs Global Counsel, which is like a lobbying firm for some of the worst, most horrific companies on the planet, which is obviously a profound conflict of interest. The other thing that's very interesting is there's absolutely nothing in the records that have been disclosed that has any fingerprints of McSweeney on them, on any sort of official record. And it's been reported now that part of the reason why that was is because McSweeney and Mandelson were talking about this on their private emails.
Yeah, right.
Which are going to have to be disclosed at a certain stage. But it does show, it's an outrageous thing to do if you're the chief of staff of the prime minister. He's basically been directed to ask due diligence questions of Mandelson. He's doing it from a private email address.
Right.
Yeah.
God almighty.
Mad stuff.
It is mad stuff, and really, you've really increased my respect for McSweeney, I have to say. I just feel like this. He really did a number on the British government, did he, Agent McSweeney?
Oh, Glock McSweeney, thank you for your service.
Yeah, thank you for your service, McSweeney. So look, Paul, you have been very generous with your time. It's been absolutely brilliant talking to you and hearing from you. The book is The Fraud. It was published in late 2025 by OR Books. Everyone should check it out. But as much as anything, it's a guide to the last crazy 6 months in British politics as well. The stuff that's happened since your book was published is really only explicable, I think, with this as your basic guide to the characters and the projects that they were involved in. So, Paul, it's been really a valuable conversation and an extremely valuable book.
Yeah, thanks so much for
thanks so much for calling a podcast. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks for having me. And also save me a slice of cake. I'm very excited.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye. Bye, everybody. We'll talk to you again soon.
Bye.